Welcome to Microsoft Excel 2010 Introduction to PowerPivot. In this video, we will discuss the powerful Excel add-in PowerPivot and how you can use this add-in to import data from various sources and analyze that data using pivot tables and pivot charts. So let's get started. Why would you use PowerPivot? Aren't pivot tables in Excel enough? PowerPivot is self-service business intelligence, meaning it lets business users analyze and generate their own reports to analyze their data. Also, there's no limitations on row and column data in PowerPivot. Excel 2010 has a limitation of 1,048,000 rows. In PowerPivot, you could analyze millions of rows or records. In PowerPivot, you can integrate data from multiple sources, such as Access, SQL Server, Excel, or any ODBC client. The data in PowerPivot is fully available to the rest of the Excel workbook. In PowerPivot, you have many of the same function capability as you have in Excel. However, there are functions available in PowerPivot called DAX functions. So here are some PowerPivot need-to-knows before we get started. First of all, PowerPivot needs to be downloaded onto your computer. It is a free client download. In order to download it, you would go to powerpivot.com or microsoft.com. From there, you would click on Download PowerPivot. You would need to know what version of Excel you have. Do you have a 64-bit version or do you have a 32-bit version? To find that out, you would go into your Excel and you would go up to File and Help. And on the right-hand side, it will tell you what version you have. Once PowerPivot is installed, when you open the PowerPivot window, it opens over your Excel window. The data that you import into your PowerPivot window cannot be edited. However, if the data changes in its original data source, you can refresh the data within your PowerPivot window. When you save your PowerPivot, it saves in an Excel workbook. However, the data is not visible in the Excel window, only when you launch PowerPivot. So let's go ahead and get into PowerPivot and see how easy it is to import data and to analyze data within the PowerPivot window. After you have downloaded PowerPivot and you open up Excel, you'll have an additional tab up at the top called PowerPivot. And when you click on that tab, you will have a ribbon that has various options to it. One of them is to launch the PowerPivot window. In order to import data into your PowerPivot, you must be in your PowerPivot window. I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and I'll be in PowerPivot for Excel. Notice the title bar up at the top. I have a quick access toolbar that has Save, Undo, and Redo, similar to the Excel window. And I can get back into my Excel window by clicking on the Switch to Workbook. And I'll be back into the Excel workbook. And then I can go back to the PowerPivot window. There are two tabs in PowerPivot. There's the Home tab, and the Home tab has some commands that are similar to your Excel workbook. You've got your clipboard group for copying and pasting. To the right, you can freeze panes, you can adjust your column widths, and you do have sorting and filtering capabilities and formatting capabilities. Probably the most important part of this ribbon is to get your external data. And you can get external data from a variety of data sources. We'll come back and do that in a little while. You also have a Design tab up at the top. And your Design tab has commands for manipulating your columns, calculations, looking at any existing connections you have to data sources. You have a relationships group to create relationships between tables that you import or to manage those relationships. And every table that you import into your PowerPivot window has properties. There is a File option on your PowerPivot window. To the left of Home, if you click on the down arrow, you'll have some file capabilities, such as saving and saving as. Both of those will save the Excel workbook. Whatever you import into your PowerPivot window will get saved as part of an Excel workbook. You do have publishing options here. You can close your PowerPivot window. You can even go on to an online forum and ask questions or view questions from other people. And there's always room for feedback, so you can always send feedback on how you like PowerPivot or what things you think should be improved. I'm going to go back to my Excel workbook, and I'm going to open up an existing Excel workbook that has some PowerPivot data in it. So I'll go up to my Open, and I'm going to open up a file called Customer Orders. Notice it is an Excel workbook. When I open it, it doesn't look like there's anything in this workbook. I have sheets at the bottom, sheet 1, 2, and 3, and there's nothing on any of those sheets at this point. However, if I go up to my PowerPivot tab and launch my PowerPivot window, I'll see that there is some data in the PowerPivot window. So let's talk about the different parts underneath the ribbon. You have your name box, which will tell you what field you're on, and I can click on the down arrow to go quickly to different fields within the table I'm on. There's a formula bar to the right, very similar to Excel. And this is where we'll go a little bit later to create a calculation. And then you've got a table in your PowerPivot window. Each of the columns represents a field from the data source, and each of the rows is a record. There are down arrows to the right of each of those fields, and when I click on one of them, very similar to an Excel filter. I've got sorting capabilities, and I can be very specific on which records I'm viewing. At the very bottom, you'll see different tabs. Every table that you import into your PowerPivot window will get placed on its own tab. So I'm on the Customers tab right now, but I can go and look at my other tables that I've already imported into this PowerPivot window. This data is coming from an Access database. I cannot change the data here in the PowerPivot window, but I can refresh the data. So if the data changes in the data source, I can refresh that data here in the PowerPivot window. For each of the tables, at the very bottom in the lower left-hand corner, I'll see how many records are in that table. And I can use the record selectors to go back and forth between the records. I can go quickly to the first record or quickly to the last record. And I can see if I go to the different tables, I'll see how many records are in each of those tables. Up at the top of the screen, I can go into my Design tab, and I can look at the existing connections. So in this case, it will show me that this is connected to an Access database called Sample Database. I can refresh from within here. I can also open the data source connection or edit the data source connection. And I can delete the connection if I wish. I'm going to close out of the existing connections dialog box. And I can also see that I have relationships if I click on Manage Relationships. So I'll see with the 4 tables that I have coming from that Access database that there are some relationships. I've got a relationship between the Order Details table and the Orders table by order ID, and I've got relationships between the other tables as well. I could create other relationships here. I can edit the existing ones, or I could delete any of the relationships as well. But I'll close. And for whichever table that I'm in, I can also look at the table properties. So the table properties will allow me to hide any of the columns that I don't wish to view. I can do any filters in here if I wish, and I'll also see when the last time this table was refreshed. So I'll cancel there as well. If I want to get back into my Excel workbook, I'll click the Switch to Workbook button on the Quick Access toolbar, and I'll be back in my workbook again. I can save this workbook, and I'm going to close this workbook as well. So let's get started from scratch with PowerPivot. Let's say I'd like to go and import some data into a PowerPivot window. After we've got the data in the PowerPivot window, we can create some calculations, and we'll also create a pivot table and a pivot chart from the data in your PowerPivot window. So, in Excel, clicking on the PowerPivot tab if you need to, and then going and clicking on the PowerPivot window launch will take you back into PowerPivot. I'm going to go to the Home tab in here, and I'm going to get some data from an Access database. So clicking from database, notice the other options. I could import from a SQL Server, but I'm going to import from my Access database. When I choose that, I'll be in the Table Import Wizard. I could give this a friendly name for the connection, or I can just keep it as Access, but I do need to go and find the database. So I'm going to click on the Browse button. I'm going to use this sample database, which is an Access 2010 database. If I needed to, I would put in my username and password. I could test the connection at this point, just to make sure the connection works. And when everything is set, I'll click on Next. The second step of the Table Import Wizard is going to ask if I want to pick from a list of tables and views that are coming from the data source, or if I'd like to write a query to be very specific about the data that I want to import into my PowerPivot window. I'm going to select from a list of tables, so I'll click on Next. The third step will give me a list of the tables that are in that data source and any queries in the data source as well. So I'm going to pick the Customers table to import, and also the Order Details table and the Orders table. We'll come back and get the Products table a little bit later. And I'm going to click on Finish. It will go through and import the data, and when it's done, it will tell me whether it's successful or not. I'm going to click on Close since this was successful. And now I'll have those three tables in my PowerPivot window. I'll have my Customers table, my Order Details table, and my Orders table. If I go up to the Design tab up at the top, I can see the existing connection, and I'll be able to see the Access sample database. And I can also click on Manage Relationships. In my case, I have relationships in the Access database. They were created on the Access end, so I'll see those relationships here. If they don't come in correctly, I can edit them here, and I can create new ones, which we'll do a little bit later. So I have a relationship between the Order Details and the Orders table, and the Orders table and the Customers table. These relationships will be important when I go and create a pivot table based on these tables. So I'm going to close out of there for now. Now suppose you do want the Products table in here as well. So I'm going to click on Existing Connections, and I'm going to open the connection. I'm going to select another table, so I'll click on Next, and I'm going to click on the Products table and Finish. Once it's done, it's telling me it's successful at the top, and I'll click on Close. And I'll have the Products table in my PowerPivot window as well. However, since I added this table after I added the other three, I do need to go and create a relationship. If I click on Manage Relationships right now, you'll notice that the products table is not in there, even though there is a relationship in the Access database between the products table and the order details table. So I'll click on the Create button, and I'm going to click on the Order Details table, and the column is Product ID, and the related table will be the Products table, and it sees Product ID in that table, so it automatically fills it in for me. And I'll click on Create. I've got my relationship, and I can close. You can tell if there's a relationship in this table with this and another table if you look up in your column headings. On the fields, if it has a little icon next to the down arrow, it will be because it's related to another table. So if I point to it, I'll see that the product ID in here is related to the product ID in the order details table. If I go down to the orders table, I'll see that there's a little icon next to the down arrow because this is related to the order ID in the order details table. In the order details table, I'll see that I have two relationships. One's with the orders table and one's with the products table. And finally, the customers table. I have a relationship between this table and the orders table. Suppose I want to add data that's not coming from that Access database. I could add it right here in this PowerPivot window and save it with the Excel workbook. So going up to the Home tab, this time I'm going to go get a data source that's from Excel. So clicking on From Other Sources will give me a list of all the sources that I can import from. So as I scroll down, you can notice some of the different data sources. And all the way towards the bottom, you're going to see Excel file. So I'm going to click on Excel file and click on Next. I have to find the file, so I'm going to browse for it, and it's called Subtotals. It does help if you know the data source, and I know in this case that the first row in the Subtotals Excel file has the field headings or column headings. So I'm going to check that and click on Next. I can get a preview of this with the Preview and Filter button, and I can see what that data looks like. If I don't want to import some of these fields, I would just take the check away from the ones that I don't want to import. I'll put those back for right now and click on OK. And then I'll click on the Inventory table and click on Finish. Once it's done, it will tell me if it's successful or not and how many records were imported. So close, and I'll have another tab at the bottom that will show me that data source. Once you've imported the table, if you decide now there are certain fields you don't want here, and you'll see that there are some fields that have no data, you can always go to the table properties, and in here you'll see a list very similar to what we saw when we previewed during the import. I can take the check away from those fields that I don't want to have imported into my PowerPivot. So I'll take those checks away and click on Save. It will refresh the data, and now I won't have those extra fields at the end. I'm going to go to the Customers table down below, and you can adjust your column widths in here. You can double click on the line between any of the columns just like you would in an Excel worksheet. You can sort, so if I wanted to sort by job title, I could do that. There's filtering capabilities, so I could click on the down arrow next to job title, and perhaps I only want to see the account assistant and the account managers. So I can choose those and click on OK. I can remove the filter and the sort by going back to that down arrow. Now it has a funnel next to it, meaning it's filtered. I can clear the sort, and I can go back and clear the filter to bring it all back and back to its original sort order. I cannot change the data here in PowerPivot. However, what if the data changes in the data source? So I'm going to go and open up that Access database. I'm going to go and open up the customers table in here and make a change to the first company name. So I'll go ahead and call it ABC Company. I can close the database, and when I get back into my PowerPivot window, notice that that first record has not changed. So up on the Home tab, there is a refresh option. When I click on the down arrow, I have two possibilities. I can refresh just the table I'm in, or I can refresh all the data sources that are in this PowerPivot window. Since I only changed that one table, I'm going to click on Refresh. Once it's done refreshing, I can click on Close, and it should refresh in my PowerPivot window. Even though I can't change the data here, I can create my own columns here in PowerPivot. For instance, if I go down to my Order Details table, notice there's a column for quantity and one for unit price. I also have a discount column as well. I'm going to add a column in here that's going to take the quantity and multiply it by the unit price. And then we'll subtract out any discount that may exist. Calculations are very similar to Excel. However, when you do a calculation, it will apply to entire columns. I'll start the calculation the same way as I would in an Excel worksheet by starting with the equal sign. If you look at the formula bar now, it has the equal sign. Then I'm going to click anywhere in the quantity column, and notice it puts the name of the table and the name of the field. The field is in square brackets. I'm going to hit the asterisk on the keyboard to multiply, and then click into unit price. After that, I want to subtract out the discount. So I'm going to hit the minus and click on discount. The order of operations is important here in PowerPivot, just like it is in Excel. However, in this case, I don't need parentheses because it will do the multiplication first, and then in my case, it will subtract out the discount from the result of quantity times unit price. Once you've got the calculation in there, all you need to do is hit Enter, and you'll have a calculated column. I can change the formatting of my calculated column by going to the Home tab, and in the Formatting group, I can choose the $sign. I have the increase and decrease decimal place buttons that I can use as well. I can change the column label by double-clicking where it says Calculated Column 1 and typing a more user-friendly name. This calculated column will now be available when I do my pivot table. Adding the calculated column will not affect the data source. It does not add this column into the Access database in our case. So let's create a pivot table based on our tables that we have here in our PowerPivot window. On the Home tab, there's a Pivot Table button, and I'm going to click on the Pivot Table button. It's going to ask me where I'd like to place my pivot table, and I'm going to put it on the existing worksheet, Sheet 1, and begin it right in A1, and click on OK. Notice up at the top I am back into my Excel workbook. I also have the two Pivot Table Tools tabs up at the top. These are contextual tabs that are just showing up because I'm in a pivot table. If I click on them, you'll notice that they're identical to a regular pivot table. The difference here, if you look at the right-hand side, you'll see a PowerPivot field list. This is different from an Excel pivot table field list. I do have the fields that are coming from the multiple tables that I have in my PowerPivot window. So you'll see if I scroll down, I have my customers table at the top with all the fields from the customers table, and then I can expand the field lists for the other tables that I'm going to be using fields from. In the field list at the bottom, very similar to a regular Excel pivot table field list. However, you do have slicer options here as well. You can do slicers in a regular Excel pivot table. However, it's part of the field list for PowerPivot, and we'll do one of those a little bit later. So now it's time to build your PowerPivot pivot table. So I'm going to scroll back up to the top so I can see my customers table. And you would add the fields the same way you would do in an Excel pivot table. If I want the company name to be in my PowerPivot pivot table, I will click on it, and it will automatically come down, get placed in the row labels section, and you'll see over on the left-hand side that my pivot table is beginning to get generated. I'm going to scroll down in my field list to my order details table, and notice the sales field here. This is the calculated field we just did. So I'd like to have that in there so I can see the total sales for each of my customers. It will automatically add it to my values section, and I can change how it's being summarized. I'm going to go ahead and add the product name, but I want that to go into my column labels. If I just click on product name, it will add it to the row labels. If I do that, I can just drag it up to my column labels section. I could drag it to the report filter. So with a pivot table, you can drag your fields wherever you'd like to place them, and your pivot table is going to adjust accordingly. There's no right or wrong here, it's just how do you want to view your data. To remove a field from your PowerPivot pivot table, you could just take the check away from the top part of the field list. If I like the pivot table the way it is, I can also make some changes to it. So sum of sales, I might want to change the name to. And also I might want to format the numbers underneath. So if I right-click over on sum of sales, I can go to the value field settings. Again, similar to a regular Excel pivot table. I can change the name for the column heading. I can also click on the number format button in here and change to the accounting format. I can go up to the Design tab up at the top, and I can change the format. Again, just like a regular pivot table in Excel. Let's say I'd like to see the different categories of products. So I can add the categories, which is part of the products table, but I'm going to add it as a slicer. So I'll drag it down and we'll do a vertical slicer, and it will add a little form next to my pivot table where I have buttons that I can click on to go and have my pivot table filter to just show the customers who have bought that particular category of product. I can see more than one category by clicking on one, holding down Control, and clicking on other ones. If I want to remove the filter and bring back all the categories, there is a clear filter button in the slicer. And that will bring back all of the categories, and I'll see the total sales for all of the customers. Once my pivot table is created, I can also create a pivot chart based on that pivot table by going up to the Options tab and clicking on Pivot Chart. If you've done charting in Excel, this should look familiar to you. Also, this is the same as with a regular Excel pivot chart. So I'm just going to keep it as column and click on OK. I can move this pivot chart. I can make any changes. I don't need the legend there that says total, so I can delete it. And whatever I'm seeing in my pivot table will also be reflected in my pivot chart. So I can use my slicer to just see certain categories of products. And whatever I choose, I'll only see the customers not only in the pivot table, but in the pivot chart that have bought that category of product. If I add any more columns into my PowerPivot window, I will get an option at the top of my field list that says things have changed and I might need to refresh, and there'll be a button to refresh right in the field list. So this pivot table and this pivot chart are based on the data that I have in my PowerPivot window. If I go back up to my PowerPivot tab, I can click on the PowerPivot window, and I'll be back into my PowerPivot window. This has been an introduction to Excel 2010's add-in feature, PowerPivot. To find out more about the videos we have to offer, contact Log On to Learn at 1-800-831-8449 or email Chris Jarvis at cjarvis@knowledgewave.com.